Well, I'm not sure that everyone has returned, but they've stopped eating chips noisily outside. So that's good enough for me. So let's resume the program for our Canada panel. Most of you are here for the introductions. You know, I'm Laura Dawson. I'm the director of the Canada Institute. Also know that we're webcasting live to our friends not in Washington, D.C. today, so hello. Canada has been known as an energy powerhouse. There's been no doubt about that brand. But the Canada brand, particularly in the United States, has suffered a bit over the last couple of years. And squaring the circle, reconnecting Canada's energy endowment with Canada's climate change commitments has been a big challenge, both for the previous government and the current government, also for the various provincial representatives. So we are really fortunate today in that we have federal and provincial representatives here to help us understand what's happening, what's going on, and to give us some ideas, not just about the national context, but also a North American and cooperative context. So we have three speakers. Frank, do you use the American pronunciation, Canadian pronunciation? Pronounce your last name for me.
Desrosiers.
Desrosiers. See, exactly. Much better than I can do that. I'm sorry. And he is the Assistant Deputy Minister, Innovation, Energy and Technology Sector. Is that correct?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Sorry, let me get this right. Assistant Deputy Minister, Innovation, Energy Technology, Natural Resources Canada. Basically, he's responsible for all the energy. To his right, at the federal level. Now, at the provincial level, to his right, we have Jetan De Silva. Many of you know Jetan, a well-known and becoming increasingly more well-known person around Washington. She is Alberta's senior representative to the United States, and she manages to be everywhere at all times. And a guy who's been here a little bit longer and is equally well-known and beloved, Frédéric Tremblay, who is the director of the Quebec Government Office in Washington. So we are delighted to have the three of them with us today. And we'll start at our far left. We'll do the usual Wilson Center format, 10 minutes or so apiece, and then a little bit of a grilling by me and then a grilling by you. You can speak from the podium or you can speak from your chair, whatever you prefer. And at the risk of mangling your surname again, we're now on first name basis. Frank,
Okay,
take
Laura,
it away.
Thank you so much. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be in such a distinguished audience and group of speakers. And a special thanks to the organizers for keeping the room just cool to perfection to make us Canucks feeling comfortable up there on the stage.
Nice Arctic chill here.
Thank you, yeah. So I thought I would speak to two things during those remarks. I don't have a deck presentation, which is a bit of a scary thought for a senior government official to speak without such visual support. Speak about the new government, which now has been in power for almost a year at the federal level. And I think it's fair to say that while we have a tradition of continuity in the federal government over the past century or so, as party change responsibility around the central government. In the area of energy and environment, in that nexus, there's been actually significant change happening, which I'll endeavor to summarize briefly, already a year into the mandate. And second, I also want to talk a little bit about the collaboration happening globally in the area of innovation and energy technology, with a particular emphasis, obviously, with our North American friends. I think, again, there have been quite a bit of action on that front during the past year. You mentioned this, Laura, right from the get-go in terms of the context. I won't dwell on it, that Canada is endowed with very large energy resources, whether on the fossil side or in terms of renewable energy. Whatever yardstick you're looking at, they are considerable. On the oil side, the third world largest reserve. On the natural gas side, also a very significant reserve. On the hydro and solar and wind, like we were blessed with lots of those resources, which generate a lot of wealth and jobs and exports and investments and all those other things. So needless to say that for any prime minister and whether the federal or provincial level, making sure that one is attentive to this sector is really critical for the country's prosperity. If I were to transition to what this new government has been striving to do, if I were to keep it to a bumper sticker and keep it real simple for the benefit of that discussion today, is to aim to have a clean, innovative economy, which kind of strike that balance between economic growth on one end and environmental protection on the other. And the kind of predicament that Laura described early on about rebuilding that trust domestically, but also with our clients abroad, was seen as important to drive that vision. And the change was noted in two ways. First on the how and the what as well. But let me start perhaps on the how, with Prime Minister Trudeau leading a charge along with his cabinet colleagues to change the way that the interaction was happening and that collaborative spirit be happening, first with the colleagues from the provinces, but also with private sector participants, with non-governmental organizations, with indigenous organizations, citizens as well. A lot more open, transparent, collaborative tone, which I'd like to think really changed the atmosphere and the dynamic domestically. And also on the OWL side, working more openly, more collaboratively with partners, not just in North America, but also globally. In terms of what, in terms of the actions, what concrete steps have been taken during those past 10 months or so? Well, because of the international agenda, COP21 meetings in Paris, and all those activities around it really brought this issue at the forefront of the government agenda. It is worth noting that literally 2 weeks after cabinet was formed, the Prime Minister was in Paris. It was actually the very first cabinet discussion was focused on the negotiation mandate for that Paris meetings. So very early, they had to obviously convey their views and announce some early measures from the Canadian government perspective. So they're starting with a target. We heard about the commitment that the US and Mexico did. In the case of Canada, it's a reduction of 30% of GHG emissions compared to 2005 level by the year 2030. So 30 by 2030 was the target announced, which, and again, is quite significant for a country that is so energy intensive as Canada and so large and cool as we're witnessing again today. So that was significant, and the Prime Minister was there along with a number of the premiers to make those commitments clear and sign on to that accord. Also at that same event were a flurry of announcements, and one I would emphasize, given its sheer significance in the energy space, is mission innovation. I trust most of you would be familiar with what that is, but just for making sure that everybody understand the significance of it, it was a commitment made by 20 countries, now 21 countries. The European Commission has joined in, with the United States, Canada, Mexico, but also China, Japan, South Korea, most of the key European countries, Germany, France, Italy, UK, and I passed many others, Brazil, who collectively committed to do three things. First is to double the pace of energy R&D investments over the next 5 years. And the reason for this is that there is a sentiment that the pace of innovation was just not sufficient to meet the ambitious goals set as part of that COP21, but also looking at the medium to longer term. As we're looking to that transition to a low carbon economy by 2050 and beyond, the kind of magnitude of reductions are envisaged. We need to really come with game-changing technologies to address that meaningfully. So that commitment was seen as being credible to get us to a space where we could actually have a shot at meeting those medium to longer term target. The second commitment by those mission innovation leaders was to also bring more private sector investments. And this is where Bill Gates, you may remember that shot on the stage with the world leaders, where he committed some of his own pocket money, $1 billion, but also brought in along other investors, 27 of those, multi-billionaire from around the world, to also invest meaningfully in that space. And the third commitment was to encourage collaboration, especially collaboration across borders, so that collectively we and the world can tackle those challenges more effectively and rapidly. So this commitment was actually made, as I mentioned, by the Prime Minister right in the first weeks of his mandate, and I must say he was enthusiastic along with Cabinet to take it on. And there's a reason for this. In the case of Canada, it is worth noting that energy itself, by its sheer production or use, is over 80% of GHG emissions. So climate change and energy go truly hand in hand. And for us, it was certainly a central component in our game plan going forward. Put things in perspective, it accounts the doubling in the case of the federal government for increasing it from $387 million a year to $775 million a year in energy R&D. So it's a significant increase. In addition to that, the first budget, which came 3 months after, announced $200 million or so for early investments, especially on electric vehicle infrastructure, oil and gas demonstration projects, and clean technology R&D. So it was meant to be the first tranche, I would say, of those spending increases. And worth noting that contrary to, say, the US experience, we're close to Capitol Hill here, it is that commitment to double the investments is actually set in our fiscal framework. So we don't have to kind of bargain and do back and forth. It's already booked, and now we have to work toward ramping it up and doing it in a thoughtful and effective manner with our various partners. Over and above that $200 million announced, we also, the government already announced also additional envelopes that are earmarked for additional investments to make that transition toward that lower carbon economy, 3 of which I would note. A first pot is $1 billion for clean technologies in natural resources. So the point of it being to make sure that those natural resources, along with other adopters, are able to champion those technologies. So we're looking at the full toolkit, the policy toolkit, in terms of looking at carbon pricing. As you know, Canada is actively exploring that with provinces, but also regulation, greening government operations, and also being early adopters of technology within our own environment, and also kind of driving that innovative spirit right across the innovation space, whether it's in universities, private sector, government labs, to really up our game in terms of clean technologies, both for meeting domestic needs, but also for the export market. A second pot has been set aside of $2 billion to assist the provincial transition toward a lower carbon future. And a third pot is for infrastructure writ large. So there's an additional $60 billion, 60, over 10 years that has been set aside, 20 of which are dedicated for green infrastructure. And there it could prove to be quite useful, especially on the deployment of some of those technologies, and make sure that we're having a meaningful impact in terms of GHG reductions and mitigation. So just to signal that this is all in a fairly short time frame, you see that in terms of both the how and the what, the commitment is rock solid, and the desire to work collaboratively with our partners to get us there, recognizing that this is not a short-term game. It is a generational shift, and we're humble in that journey, but we do feel that once that vision is laid out, we do have to take concrete steps to get us there. That would bring me, Laura, to the second part of the conversation in terms of the collaboration globally. And as you can see, this is something that is we see as being important. Canada is a player, an important player, but only one of the member of the family of nations out there who can bring some solution to those important issues. And we felt that with our mission innovation partners, which are meeting actually in London next week to take stock of where we are midway in the year, but more particularly with our North American energy partners, this would be a natural fit for us to work together on this. And there have been 2 important events that took place during the past months, and we heard reference to those in the morning. The first was to have the 3 ministers, Secretary Moniz, Secretary Joaquin, and Minister Carr, meeting in Winnipeg in February. Strange place to meet, by the way, for any one of you who ventured in Winnipeg in the winter. It's kind of cold. To sign an MOU where they laid out the game plan in terms of increased collaboration. We heard the story about data from Madame Larose this morning, but there's also been ambitions set in terms of policy objective, as well as innovation. I'll get to it in a minute. And the second, obviously noteworthy event was the North American leaders statement that was made coming out of their Ottawa meetings in June. And there, and we see all those news releases and communique coming in and out. Sometimes it's hard to keep up. There was actually in the energy R&D space significant commitments being made in 6 key areas that have been identified by our senior scientists and senior executive in all 3 governments to try to drive the game in terms of energy collaboration, energy technology collaboration between the 3 countries. And allow me perhaps to describe those briefly. It'll give you a bit of a sense of the concreteness of what's envisaged here. First one is around carbon capture, use and storage, CCUS for short, where there have been a lot of action. Actually, North America is truly one of the world leaders in terms of work there, both in terms of driving demonstration projects, we actually have 4 large-scale projects in Canada, including 2 that have just been launched, and the one in Saskatchewan, the Boundary Dam project, 1 megaton project, the first commercial-scale coal-fired plant that is with CCUS to it. It's a $1.5 billion project, fully operational by now. And the second project launch in the province of Alberta, we may hear about it some more, the Shell Quest project, another 1 megaton project, same kind of scale, $1.5 billion or so, which is also fully operational by now. So pretty significant projects that we were looking to share the findings, the experience with our North American colleagues, but also with other partner countries around the world. And also in the area of research and development. And there we are fortunate, particularly in Canada and the US, to have world-leading labs and private firms who are developing not just current but next-gen technologies in terms of R&D. And our main goal there is to lower the cost of the carbon capture part, which is the most expensive part of the CCS process, and to bring it to a point where it could be commercially viable without having to subsidize such CCS or CCUS facilities. Also worth noting that there's been quite a bit of effort being made by firms and governments on the area of use of carbon, as we're trying, again, to make it more economical for those projects to come on stream. A second area that has been identified by leaders is around unconventional oil and gas. Needless to say, after the statistics we heard about this morning, that across North America, that production is steadily increasing, and therefore very important to address both from an energy technology, cost competitiveness, but also a GG perspective. And I would note there, for instance, the collaboration that has been happening between the 3 countries in the area of shale resources, where we've all heard from our respective citizens and communities concerns in terms of the impact of shale development, especially as we get to such scale we're witnessing and forecasting. And the point of it is trying to develop a research agenda whereby we could actually map out collectively what we need to address and share our findings along the way. And this has been, in my view, a very positive effort, which we most definitely will be pursuing with enthusiasm. A third is around methane emissions reduction. So we heard that commitment again throughout our session today, a 40 to 45% reduction by the year 2025. So we've done good work in the past with Pemex in Mexico on methane capture from flaring and venting operation of their operations. And a lot of it, which is the compelling and the happy part, can be done economically. The payback for many of those projects are within a year or 2 max, because you end up capturing very valuable hydrocarbons in the process and being able to use it either as diluent or sell it to the marketplace. So there's actually ways to meet those bold targets in a way that is financially attractive for firms and the players. And that combined with the new technologies we're working on and the regs that are being enacted by our respective governments give me confidence that our countries will be able to make good on that promise. The fourth area is around smart grid and energy storage. For those of you who are obviously familiar with this area, as we're bringing more and more intermittent power to the grid, finding ways to manage it effectively is mission critical. I would also point out that there's one particular challenge that is particularly important for Canada, is getting our remote communities and the indigenous communities off diesel. A challenge I understand that is shared by the US and Mexico, who also have remote communities of their own, where they're looking to do the exact same thing. So this is an area where we've had some focused attention lately. A fifth area is around advanced heating and cooling. A lot of waste in this area. It's pretty common you would see in buildings and operations where both systems actually operate at the same time, which is kind of nuts when you think of it. But that's the way typically those systems are being managed. And if you multiply this to the scale of our economies, this is tens of thousands of points where you were wasting energy like there's no tomorrow. This is dumb. And there's also a chance not just to better optimize our buildings and better use those systems, but also to develop new technologies. And we've been investing into our Canada Energy National Labs in more energy efficient refrigeration in particular for grocery stores, for hockey rinks. Gotta talk hockey, it's a Canada panel. Which are now spread out around the country and are being exported. And we think there's opportunities to do more in the area of next-gen heat pumps and use of CO2 for refrigeration as well. And the final area that I would flag is around clean transportation, which accounts for roughly a quarter of our emissions. So certainly important. I've mentioned some of the early investments we've made around electric vehicle, but we're also exploring with our US and Mexican friends how we could look at the transportation corridors, whether it's for natural gas, for trucks, whether it's for EV transportation. We're all building up our charging infrastructure through our respective efforts, but it'd be nice so that our citizens can actually go across borders and being able to refuel or recharge along the way. And we continue to invest through our R&D efforts on programs around advanced batteries. The US made significant investments there too, materials and biofuels as well. So that, I guess, summarizes kind of what Canada has been experiencing lately at the federal level. And we've heard around the climate change table, Canada is back. But Canada is back both in terms of our approach to it, but also in terms of concrete actions. So I'll now turn the floor to my colleagues from Alberta and Quebec.
Thanks, Frank. That was great. Zatan, do you want to speak from there or speak from the... And Fred, you can have some slides, right? Yes. Okay.
Well, merci, Frank, for that Canadian overview. I'll speak to the Alberta perspective, a bit about both our resource and some of the infrastructure challenges you have no doubt heard about. So first of all, thank you for including Alberta and Quebec in this forum. As you may know, in Canada, the energy resources are actually owned by the provinces. So it's very important that we have partnership between the federal and provincial territorial levels in terms of taking action, how we manage those resources and address the issue of climate change. So I'm happy to be here to speak. Of course, the energy outlook in Alberta is a little bit challenging these days. Over the past 18 months, we've seen some pretty considerable price declines. We also saw the denial of the Keystone XL pipeline presidential permit. And then, of course, we had our quite catastrophic fires up in Fort McMurray earlier this year. So I'm sure you've heard all about that in the news. And it made me lead some people to believe the worst about our prospects. But we are eternal optimists in Alberta and really great innovators. The fact that we're able to extract the oil sands resource at all is in fact quite a technological miracle. So we're convinced that with that continued commitment to entrepreneurship and innovation, we'll continue to drive down our per barrel emissions and see our energy production evolve with the changing times. So I'll talk a bit about oil at first. It's probably what Alberta's best known for. So obviously the declining price in oil has put a lot of pressure on the sector in Alberta. The oil sands in particular are very capital intensive, and some reservoirs are relatively high cost. So what we've seen as prices have declined is some companies have put projects on hold. We've also seen considerable layoffs in the sector, which has been challenging for the province. And then on top of that, the fires in Fort McMurray, when they were at their height, our production was down about 1 million barrels a day. And that had a direct impact, obviously, on Alberta's economy, but as Frank pointed out as well, on Canada's overall GDP. But when you look going forward, that production is mostly back online now, and by the end of this year, we will be at near record production levels of just over 4 million barrels a day, and we expect to return to record export levels around $3 million barrels a day to the United States. So these production numbers mask two opposing trends. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers forecast that in 2016, we'll see a 3.8% decline in total Canadian conventional production. And this decline is consistent with what you're seeing here in the United States with a lower price environment and fewer rigs in operation. So I don't know that we'll necessarily see an increase in light production in the future. But this decline is offset by continuing growth in heavy oil production, predominantly from the oil sands. So when we look at the CAP figures again there, it looks like with projects already underway, we'll see up to an additional 600,000 barrels per day being produced in the oil sands by 2018. So production there continues to increase. Alberta is also home to very large natural gas deposits. And the major story in Canada, of course, is the ongoing shift in markets due to increased U.S. natural gas production. In 2006, Canadian exports to the U.S. were split approximately a quarter to the west, half to Midwest, and a quarter to the eastern U.S. But by 2015, with growing U.S. production, Canadian exports to the U.S. have declined by approximately 25%. And we've lost 2/3 of our markets in the eastern region and a quarter of our markets in the U.S. Midwest. And this, of course, makes sense when you look at the tremendous increase in U.S. shale production. Obviously, we're watching this closely, and we'd like to be competitive in that market again. So we're watching how proposed pipelines linking Northeast U.S. production to the U.S. Midwest and Ontario's Dawn hub will further impact Alberta's market. Ontario is Canada's largest natural gas market, and U.S. producers are hoping to back Western Canadian gas out of that market by using new U.S. pipelines. TransCanada is currently working with a bunch of Western Canadian producers to see if they can come to an agreement on the tolls that would allow them to use the existing TransCanada mainline and with reduced tolls remain competitive in the Ontario market. This will be something to watch very closely over the next year because it will have a very significant impact on Western Canadian gas producers going forward. And if you think about what's been in the news lately in terms of some pretty major pipeline acquisitions, TransCanada's acquisition of the Columbia pipelines and Enbridge's proposed merger of Spectra are efforts to ensure that both companies are well positioned regardless of the market outcome. So then to talk about pipelines for a little bit, something I'm sure we all heard a little bit about over the past few years, I can talk about a few of the projects that are currently under consideration in Canada. The first of which is Northern Gateway. So this is a pipeline that would take oil sands resources from Alberta west to the west coast. Prior to the election of the Trudeau federal government, the previous government had permitted this pipeline subject to 209 conditions, 113 of 113 of which had to be met before construction. But in June of this year, the Federal Court of Appeal quashed that permit on the grounds that the federal government had failed in its duty to consult with Indigenous peoples prior to issuing the cabinet order. Earlier this week, we saw that both the federal government and Enbridge announced that they would not appeal the decision, and Enbridge has called on the federal government to conduct another round of consultations, and we're waiting to hear how the federal government proposes a path forward. Energy East is another pipeline that's been in the news. So the National Energy Board has started the review process for that pipeline, which would carry oil sands east to St. John, New Brunswick. But recently we had 3 panel members overseeing the review who recused themselves. The board now has to appoint some new panelists. If you'd like more details, I'd be happy to talk offline, but I think it's safe to say that that project might be delayed just a tad. And then the third project is the Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan project. And the federal government has received the recommendation to approve the pipeline from the National Energy Board and is now reviewing it. An independent ministerial panel was appointed to hear from and talk with Indigenous peoples and affected communities along the pipeline and shipping routes to seek additional views from the public before making a decision. The panel will report to the Federal Minister of Natural Resources by November the 1st of this year, and its work will complement but not replace the ongoing Crown consultations between the federal government and Indigenous peoples on the project. So the federal government has announced that its final decision will be informed by the National Energy Board recommendations, consultations with Indigenous peoples, public input gathered through the ministerial panel, and comments received on the draft assessment of upstream GHG emissions. So you may have heard that earlier this year, the federal government announced changes to the NEB process in terms of how energy infrastructure gets permitted, with a focus to increase consultation with communities and Indigenous peoples and considering upstream GHG emissions before approving any project. So all of this is taking place, as Frank mentioned before, that the federal government, provinces and territories are working together on a number of major policy initiatives, including around climate change. The overwhelming majority of Canada's oil and gas production takes place in Alberta. We are about 37% of Canada's GHG emissions, and much of the oil reserves in Canada are located in Alberta. So our provincial government's announcement in November 2015 of our climate leadership plan is having a very direct impact on the sector and on Canada's ability to meet its international commitments. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Climate Leadership Plan, it included a $30 price a ton on carbon, a 40 to 45% reduction in methane emissions, and a legislated cap on emissions from the oil sands sector, as well as phasing out of coal-fired electricity by 2030. At that announcement, our Premier was joined by CEOs from major energy companies, Indigenous leaders, environmental leaders, and civil organizations, which is quite a big accomplishment. This was something where the government worked very hard to get to yes, and of course you need industry on side if you're going to meet your targets. So this really is a huge, tremendous change for the province and for the country as a whole. The Prime Minister, as mentioned, is working towards developing a national climate plan, and we expect to hear more news later this fall. But as it currently stands in Alberta, we've got 80% of our population now covered by a price on carbon. BC and Alberta have set a price of $30 a ton, and Ontario and Quebec are engaged in a cap and trade system. Then on the other side, you've got a couple of provinces who have expressed some mild concern with imposing any kind of price. So for anyone who's followed domestic discussions within Canada, I think we probably have a few more conversations to have before we get to yes on that one. But the federal government is very, very engaged. And I think the fact that you've got so much of the population, the major provinces already on side, I'm very optimistic about how that will come together. So I think, from what you're hearing in the news, you probably hear a lot about the conflict, sort of the downside in the oil and gas industry. But I think it's important to highlight that our industry does continue to work to innovate, and there is that strong commitment to addressing climate change. And so now we've got one of the major energy producers in the world that's also operating under some of the most progressive climate regulations, which I think is quite an accomplishment. And I think it's also important to note that despite the decreasing price of oil, the provincial government has chosen to go ahead. They announced this plan back in November, but they legislated it this spring. So it shows that despite continued changes in the industry, they're very, very committed to this path forward. The other important policy initiative to note is, of course, the relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada. The current government in Alberta was one of the pillars of their platform when they were elected. And for those who don't know, this was the first time the party in power in Alberta had changed in 44 years. So it was a pretty big change for the province. They campaigned on taking action on climate change, but they also campaigned on a more respectful, mature relationship with Indigenous peoples. And this isn't just an issue in Canada. We've seen certainly in North Dakota, the Dakota Access Pipeline, that this is an issue here in the United States as well. The federal government also was elected and campaigned on changing the relationship with Indigenous peoples, which is absolutely necessary. It does, however, present challenges across the full spectrum of policy issues, both social, economic, and everything else. But you do see, obviously, with the court's decision around Northern Gateway, in the current situation around Dakota Access, that you have to meaningfully engage if you do want to get to yes on energy infrastructure. I'll just speak briefly too on North America. So I do want to talk a little bit about Alberta's collaboration with Mexico, as that is important for us. So we see the changing Mexico's energy reform as a very important development for our province and for the continent's energy future. In some ways, we're definitely competitors, but Mexico's opening of the market has created some real opportunities for Alberta companies. We've got TransCanada that's already made some substantial investments there and has about 300 people working in Mexico already. Alberta is also cooperating with Mexico in terms of regulation and training. So the Alberta Energy Regulator has an MOU with its Mexican counterpart. And Mexico is working with the AER to develop its regulations as it moves forward. And we've been sharing best practices together since 2014. The University of Calgary and the Mexican Ministry of Energy also recently signed a collaboration note that opens up a long-term partnership on the research front there between Mexico and the University of Calgary. As part of this partnership, Mexico has allocated $12 million over 4 years from their hydrocarbon fund for Mexican organizations that want to collaborate with the University of Calgary on energy research and education. And we think that this kind of shared commitment to developing the next generation of regulations and regulators will ensure that our North American oil and gas sector is sustainably managed going forward. So obviously lots of mini market and political dynamics at play. And we hope that when we're invited to speak again next year, that we'll have continued growth in energy production, a progressive and workable, effective climate policy that gives industry certainty and also continues to drive down our emissions per barrel, and hopefully a more certain infrastructure approval process that takes into account both the impacts on the environment and our relationship with Indigenous peoples, but also allows a path to yes. So I will leave it there and turn it over to my good friend Frédéric. Thank you.
Thank you. Frédéric, Savannah's going to spark up your slides.
Thank you. Ça va bien?
Oui.
Not too bad. It's going to be in English, don't worry. Thank you for having me today to discuss about the Quebec energy sector. The situation in Quebec is a little bit different in compared to Alberta. Of course, we have a lot of water, as you can see on the first picture. So I would present broadly the sector and how the economy, the environment, and energy in Quebec are all integrated to make a better future for the next generations. Can I just... Okay, key facts. Quebec is one of the world's leading producer of hydroelectricity, and 98% of our electricity produced in Quebec comes from hydraulic sources. The 2% left is about wind and a little bit of fossil fuels for remote communities. Electricity satisfies 37% of Quebec's energy needs. Talking about water a little bit before, we have 3% of the planet's freshwater reserves. So that's a lot of water, and that's the choices that we made 60 years ago to develop this hydraulic and this hydropower capacities. It was, of course, geographical choices, but also a political one. Quebec before had a lot of pressure, for example, for France to develop the nuclear sector, so decided to go with hydropower. We use the equivalent of about 35 barrels of oil per person per year. That's a lot. We want to reduce that. Sorry, Alberta. But Quebec still has the lowest GHG emissions per capita in Canada. In terms of the economy, what's this the sector generates in terms of economy in Quebec? We're talking about 4.2% of the GDP in Quebec. It's about $13 billion. The electricity production, this is interesting graphics. You see in the US, I'm sorry, it's in French, but the US, Canada, and Quebec electricity production, you see in the US, coal is still the main one. Then you move to Canada, it's hydropower, and then you see all the blue in Quebec, this is hydropower. So we have a little bit of biomass, coal, wind power, and the rest is a bit of fossil fuels. You see in terms of percentage, US 13% of renewable, Canada 66, and Quebec overall 99. A few months ago, beginning of the summer, the Quebec government launched its new energy policies, 2030. We have pretty ambitious targets. The first one is to enhance the energy efficiency by 15% in Quebec, reduce by 40% the amount of petroleum products consumed, eliminate the use of thermal coal, increase by 25% the share of renewable energies in total energy production, and increase by 50% bioenergy production. I left some documents at the entrance, executive review of this policy. In terms of the renewables is probably the most interesting and the most ambitious one. You see in 2016, we have about 47% renewable energies in terms of consumptions. We want to move that to 60%. So we'll do that by increasing the electricity production, biomass, reducing the petroleum products, coal, natural gas, and also decentralized energy such as geothermal and solar energy. So that's one of the main targets that we have. In terms of partners to achieve also this policies, of course, Hydro-Québec is the only one utility, so this is a bit different compared to the U.S. There's many utilities in the U.S. In Quebec, it's only one. It's Hydro-Québec, state-owned company, talking about 20,000 employees who do production, distribution, and also transmission lines in Quebec, but also working with the U.S. partners. Also, HQ US, so Hydro-Québec has also employees in the US working on some project transmission lines. So for example, so you see the maps, and also I will leave some documents about that at the entrance. You see this is all the transmission lines in Quebec, talking about 620 miles. So from the major dams in northern Quebec in the Bay James. So to bring down that electricity that demands a lot of expertise, so that's why Quebec developed this 735 transmission line to bring power down to Montreal, Quebec. And we have two main projects that Hydro-Québec is working with, two main partners in the US, Eversource and TDI, to bring power to New England with the Northern Pass, and also to New York with the Champlain Hudson. I talk about energy, environment, the economy. We want to integrate all those sectors in Quebec. Over the last years, the province of Quebec, but also Alberta, BC, Ontario have been pretty, they look forward to develop those new policies to incorporate GHG emissions target to all those sectors, the energy, but also the economy. So in Quebec, we've been pretty ambitious regarding that, or GHG emissions reduction, considering that the energy sector is already clean. So for by 2020, 2012, we already reduced our emissions by 8% below the 1990 levels. It's exceeding the reduction target by 2%. But if you see the 2020 and the 2030, we're talking about 20% below 1990 levels and 37.5 below 1990 levels in 2030. So that's pretty ambitious. If you see the GHG emissions by sectors, our main challenge is the transportation sector. You see the energy production is only 3.6% of our GHG emissions, but then it's transportation. It's about the same percentage for every jurisdictions in North America. Maybe just a few words on the industrial. You see it's only 13%. They did a great job in Quebec to reduce their GHG emissions over the last 10 years. For that, we put in place policies. The main one is the Quebec carbon market that have been created in 2013 actually, and we linked the market with California in 2014. Ontario announced last year that they will join it. It should happen in the year to comes. When they will join it, the WCI, so the Western Climate Initiative carbon market, will have a population of 62 million people and a GDP of more than $3.7 trillion. So indeed, in Canada, it's over 80% of the population of Canada that would be under a cap and trade program or a carbon tax over the next years. It's also the carbon market is the only one that have been designed in the world by subnationals governments. So the importance also of the subnationals governments in this sector, in those issues, and also the Paris Agreement recognize also the role of subnationals to tackle climate change. Talking about the economic a little bit later. I said that the transportation sector for Quebec is the main challenge. As we have all this hydropower and it's cheap, for us it makes sense also to develop the electrification of transportation sector. So we put in place the strategy. We have the ambitions to put 100,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2020. This is in 4 years. That will reduce by 150,000 tons the GHG emissions produced by the transportation sector. It's not a lot, but just to achieve 100,000 electric vehicles, that's a good challenge. That would reduce, just to give you an idea, by 60 million the number of liters of fuel consumed annually in Quebec. Talking about 5,000 jobs. So electrification of transportation is not only about EVs, but also a transit system. The Caisse de dépôt et de placement, which is the second largest pension fund in Canada, just announced the building of a new electric train in Montreal. It's a $5 billion electric train project that will finally connect the airport of Montreal to the downtown. So this is a huge project that would be financed by the users, but also with revenues possibly from the carbon market. Talking about the electrification of transportation, transit, but also school buses. Yesterday, this picture had been taken yesterday. The only electric school buses available in North America is made in Quebec, and the company is Autobus Lyon, Lion Bus. They were here in DC yesterday at the embassy, so we work closely with our friends at the Canada Embassy to promote those new technologies. And the company is brand new. They only commercialized this product since January of this year. And that's a concrete example of all those new technologies coming to market to reduce emissions. But also for us, when we created the carbon market, we wanted to generate that kind of economy, this new green economy, and this company has been supported by the carbon market. So we're very glad to see this bus running in DC yesterday. Thank you very much. Just wanted to present you broadly the Quebec energy sector. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer on the grill with Laura, but with you. You can follow us on Twitter at QC Washington, and also I have my Twitter account. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Frederic. All right. The challenge with so much progress is bringing it all together in a coherent package. We have heard about so many great Canadian initiatives at the federal level, at the provincial level. It is really, it's mind-boggling, it's inspirational. I go to meetings here in Washington and elsewhere in the US, and they're looking to Canada for the Canadian model. And I'm not sure we have the Canadian model. We have a lot of really good provincial and sub-federal models and some good federal models. As many of you know, a lot of the areas of decarbonization policies are under provincial jurisdiction in the Canadian Constitution, so they have authority over many of these things. And so I'm going to put Frank on the grill first. We've got great policies coming out of Quebec, we've got great policies coming out of Alberta, we've got great policies coming out of BC, Ontario, and others yet to be determined, but they're all really, really different. So, Frank, how is the federal government going to square the circle on this? How can you coordinate such great progress into a national structure?
I would step back and say, like, this has been the story of our federation. Like, it's not about trying to come with one model necessarily for such a diverse and large country. Part of it is also experimenting and having different provinces responding to different local, regional issues that are unique to them. Like what's required in the case of Alberta around oil and gas is clearly not what's suitable for a Quebec environment. And that's not bad or wrong, it's just the reality of the dynamic happening there. And we see ourselves as a federal government as being the partner to make sure that we can assist such transition, in this case, to a lower carbon economy in the ways that makes the most sense there. So we don't have to choose one R&D initiative. We can look at a suite, a portfolio of projects in the area of transportation to address the kind of concern that Frédéric conveyed around oil and gas extraction and coming with technology that drastically reduce the amount of energy requirements as input for extraction of oil. And we have a number of research pathways in that direction that are currently being pursued. So these are just two simple examples, but we do this across the Federation, and Canes tend to be humble by nature, almost to a fault. But we're pretty good at this in terms of kind of facilitating this kind of exploration and collaboration. And I guess the challenge, and this is where I would venture to say that we have now more than ever in our recent political history, a greater degree of alignment around the broad goals, the objective we're trying to address, which is, in this case, climate change. While there's some debates on elements, broadly speaking, the provincial and federal governments are aligned in terms of the direction at the highest level, and they're motivated to get us there. And we do think that it would be in the country's best interest to have a sense of having a common plan, an integrated plan, and that is what we've been working actively at the officials, senior officials, and ministerial level, and first ministers very shortly later this fall, to come to having such a plan. Which I'm quite confident we're going to get to.
Good. I mean, as a trade economist, I would, if I can give the government some policy advice, please ensure that the cost of carbon remains consistent in all jurisdictions, so that we don't have to impose carbon tariffs, and it isn't a diversion for investment from low carbon cost jurisdictions, from high carbon cost jurisdictions to low carbon cost jurisdictions. I think that the rest of North America is looking to Canada to figure that out, so that we can then have best practices for the broader region.
We have 4 chapters of discussions in our engagement with provincial partners. It's around mitigation, adaptation, innovation, clean tech, and price of carbon. I would argue that the 4th one is the most challenging. The other 3 areas we're pretty much there. Like, there's obviously discussions here and there, but like at the macro level, I think we're largely aligned. On the price of carbon, as we heard earlier from Gitan, like the largest jurisdiction in Canada, the 4 largest provinces are already in that zone. With different models, but they are already pricing carbon in their own way. So the federal government already signaled its clear intention to have a system in place. Now we have to just figure out the our part.
Good. Gitan, Frédéric, could you comment on the collaboration, cooperation from the national to the provincial level, and also provincial to provincial? Gitan?
Sure. Well, I would just add first, in Canada, we're big on mutual recognition as opposed to harmonization. And you see that across a number of fronts. So I think this will be another indication of that. We had signals from the Federal Minister for Environment and Climate Change that the plan is not to have a one-size-fits-all model. But as Frank points out, we need to take steps that reflect our domestic energy profile, which is very different across the country. I do feel for the federal government and that the previous government chose not to take the action that the current government is taking. So how do you knit together a variety of programs where, similar to what's happened in the United States, we saw some national actors in Canada move forward? I think that the federal government, they have to be realistic that, the fact that you do have 80% of the population covered, the fact that a jurisdiction like Alberta, which is 37% of the emissions, is taking action is a very positive step. They'll definitely have some challenges ahead of them. But there are federal, Frank was very humble, there are federal regulations that they can impose, which will, though a lot of it lies in provincial jurisdiction, and of course you want everyone to come to the table and agree, the federal government does have the ability to impose certain regulations, and the sense that I get is that they will exercise that authority if they need to.
Good. Frederick?
Certainly the collaboration with the government of Canada at the federal level has changed since October. The fact that the new government wants to address those issues, which is new also in the federation. Quebec, as we said, BC, Ontario, they've been in that in those sectors for a long time. So we're glad to see the federal government engaged in those issues. Important. And GHG emissions, they don't stop at the border. They don't stop between Ontario and Quebec. They move forward. So we have to all work together on that. You mentioned the collaboration in North America also. Forgot to mention, but Quebec, Ontario, and Mexico also signed an agreement for the cap and trade programs. So you mentioned also the price. The price could be also an issue. The $30 in BC, in Alberta, but in Quebec and with the California market and Ontario, the price is between $12, $13, $14, and it's a market base. So the systems are a bit different, but I think the intention is to put the price on carbon. That's the most important move to do if we want to really address those climate change issues, is to put a price on carbon. I think every studies and think tanks here, but also in the world, agree on that. So we have to move in that direction. We have to do it all together.
Okay. I'm very impressed by the climate change initiatives, by the new direction. Canada is back. Canada's turned a corner. What I don't hear so much about, though, is continuing Canadian competitiveness in the energy sector. So much of Canada's GDP is directly or indirectly from the energy sector: oil and gas, electricity, renewables. What is Canada doing to also promote a competitiveness agenda, ensuring Canada's competitiveness in the world, in the region? Jetin was talking about getting to yes on infrastructure. Is infrastructure a key part of that? I'll start again with Frank.
Sure, I guess maybe 3 points I would register. Absolutely, competitiveness is top of mind for us. I spoke to a innovative and economic and dynamic economy. That's for sure a prime preoccupation for us. And I would emphasize maybe a first point to note is that when we're, for instance, talking about reducing GHGs, like if you look at the oil and gas space, for instance, reducing energy input for extraction is actually a double winner. Like it's not only good in terms of reduced emissions, but it's also reduced the cost of extraction. And the kind of pathways I've referenced to that we're working toward actually would lead to both reduction, significant reduction, I'm talking like 50, 60, 70% plus of emissions, while reducing costs at the same time. So that's our ambition, and we think we can actually do both. And that same is true across many of the space, like I used energy efficiency examples earlier. Again, they make business sense, and there's the payback is there for the firms to pursue. Sometimes they need a little bit of nudging, a little bit of demonstration projects and support, but we think they actually make business sense. A second area I would flag is around clean technologies. Like we see it as a growth opportunity. We see it as a business where Canada will be seen and branded as a world leader in that space. We every time we engage, I was meeting with the Chinese earlier in the week. Our minister was in India last week. met with the European Commission and during that time period. All of those three flag like the interest to attract this kind of technologies in their own market, because they have significant issues to deal around water issues, around air quality, around GHG emissions. So the market demand there is considerable. Canada is fortunate to have a very strong base of companies in that space. We have over 50,000 workers in the clean tech sector who want to grow and grow it fast, and seize on those opportunities on the domestic and global market, and not just North America, but like truly globally. So this is clearly one of the point of action we'd like to pursue. And on the last point, maybe around the investor uncertainty for infrastructure projects, for instance, that's top of mind for the government, and I think we've all know that the government has invested a lot of effort to deal with the current projects, but also with making sure that the review in place for the future is deemed to be credible, robust, and balanced in its approach. So we're putting a lot of effort alongside with our colleagues at the provincial, but also Indigenous leaders and various communities involved to make sure we get it right. But finding that balance is not easy, and we heard a story about Mexico and trying to find that sweet spot earlier. We're striving to do the same thing.
Good. Any comments on competitiveness? You're both the best salesman in the world for your particular jurisdiction. You're out selling your region's energy every single day. But anything additional on that?
Well, sure, I can say, and Alberta took the approach we did with the view to demonstrating to other oil and gas producing jurisdictions that you can do this and continue to grow your economy. Our goal is to be the progressive energy producer of choice. We know that the world is transitioning off of fossil fuels, but that's not going to happen tomorrow. And in the meantime, we would hope that people would look to Alberta as their supplier, given that we do have this strong commitment to the environment. I mean, obviously, we'd like to see a common price emerge. I think that would be helpful. However, the flip to that is that by taking action on climate, we are also allowing companies to de-risk future investment. I'm sure many of you heard about the Exxon case. It's in the news, and looking at that, whereas we can say in Alberta there is a price, and therefore, companies have taken the action that was required in that regulatory framework. So we see that there is a potential advantage there as well.
Good. I'm monopolizing these folks. I'm going to ask one more question and then ask you to see if you have any additional questions. We are sitting here in Washington. We've got an assembled group of Washington denizens. We've got 50 more of them sitting at their computers watching this live on the web. If I could ask you, as federal, as Alberta, as Quebec, what are your main objectives in working with the United States within the sort of 1-year horizon? What are your priorities here? What message do you want those folks to know? Frank?
So maybe I'll focus on the space that I'm responsible for, innovation and energy technology, which I know best. I think our leaders have laid out the pathway pretty clearly, both our ministers and prime ministers and presidents. So our job now is to deliver. I've mentioned those 6 priority areas that have been identified. There's a lot there for us to chew on, and make sure that we are implementing.
Good. I'm sorry,
discipline and making that happen. So for me, that's job number 1, is just getting it done. And I'm glad to report, and I'm about to meet with my USDOE colleagues again this afternoon. We've actually been very successful at doing that. And I would like to report back in 6 months, or a year from now, that we have more concrete large-scale projects happening, demonstrations projects happening on either side of the border, and trying to bring our resources. The 3 governments have significant resources devoted to energy R&D, looking to crank it up significantly. Doubling it within the period is a significant effort on our respective countries. But as we do so, we'd like to have that collaborative feature built in. Like a lot of those issues are common. Like our continent is the same. And not surprisingly, the kind of issues that we deal on the energy side are very similar indeed. So if we can kind of pool our resources and do it together, and that's a bit of a change of the business model, which has a lot of issues around IP management and contracts, and how do you do the call for proposal. It's not easy from a program management perspective, but it can surely be done and must be done. And I'm convinced as we, as mission innovation countries, are devising some of those collaborative models, that they'll just become permanent features now of how we do business.
Good.
So I'm excited, I have to say. This is, for us, a very supportive environment to get to those broad goals that our planet has set for itself. But I think we're now in a way better spot than we were just a short year ago, pre-Paris, like in terms of making some significant headways.
Good. Sarah from CSIS this morning mentioned the challenges of a slow growth economy, low demand economy on implementing innovation objectives. How concerned are you about that?
I don't want to monopolize the
you be
perspective.
quick and then they can be long.
I'm an economist, so I do care for those things, and it has multiple impact in terms of tax revenues for us to free up to carry on those various priorities. The point that she was referencing in terms of the slower growth in terms of demand, and therefore the capacity to renew our stock of generating capacity to make it cleaner is also true. Albeit in the case of Canada, over 80% of our emissions are GHG free. Thanks to hydropower, nuclear power, renewable energy, wind, solar, we have it like in large quantity, and we saw the graph early on, and we still would strive to do more, but we're already a very clean electricity system. So I don't think it impacts quite in the same way as maybe in the U.S. Context, but it's certainly something that we're very attentive to.
Thanks. Jatan, what's on your Washington to-do list?
So I spent a lot of time spreading the good word about Alberta's climate plan. I think that the oil sands have a bad reputation across a lot of this country. Some of that is founded, a lot of it is not. We very strongly disagree with the president's characterizations that oil sands is the dirtiest oil on the planet. We would argue that Alberta's commitment to climate and environmental policies are considerably more progressive than a lot of major oil producing jurisdictions here in the United States. So I'm just getting out and talking to people about what we're doing and trying to correct the record and demonstrate to them that we are really the progressive energy producer of choice.
Fred?
We're working closely with the states as well. As I mentioned, we have two main transmission lines projects with New York State, but also with New England State, so that occupy a lot of our energy. Also for the carbon market, we want to expand it, of course. So our partners is California, but we're looking for other jurisdictions also to join the market. Ontario will join it, but we want to engage in new discussions with Reggie about that. We see if those states could be interested to do kind of linkage, maybe not a full linkage of the two programs, but that could be a possibility as well. In terms, you mentioned the question of competitivity. I think also innovation is probably one of the key. In Quebec, with Hydro-Québec and the IREC, which is the Research Institute of Hydro-Québec, they have developed a new battery, so for the energy storage. This battery is 1.2 megawatts. It's for the utilities. It's huge. It's like a big container. We think that's the future as well. So there's probably a way to compensate indeed this low economy, this low growth that is coming in the upcoming years. But certainly that kind of innovations generates by this new policies should probably compensate that. Yeah.
Good. A couple of questions from the room. Who's got a mic? There's a mic. Gentleman in the back. Any other? Please introduce yourself.
Thank you for the comments. I'm Jack Warner with the Climate Institute, also a resident of Cape Breton. On transportation, it is a very important sector, and I was wondering what is happening in terms of collaboration at the federal level, provincial level, in terms of looking at battery storage and what you're doing with innovation in battery storage in Canada and working with the U.S. and trading. And then also on your electric vehicle program, the second issue there is creating the infrastructure and getting the charging stations put in place and all that. And we're doing a lot of that here in the States as well. So just kind of wanted to get a feel for where you're at with both the federal government helping you and creating a good infrastructure for the use of electric vehicles and the buses and so forth.
Sure, happy to take a stab at this, Jack. So I would say not just battery storage, but storage generally, because there's multiple technologies that we're looking at on the storage side, and it's actually a point of strength in Canada. We've got companies who are leading in the flywheel sector around long-term energy storage using EAT, and there's many ways to do that, whether we do it at the community level, at the individual sites. Yes, battery storage is also one of those areas, and actually IREC, the Institute for Research on Electricity in Quebec, probably the largest research institute in North America in the area of electricity, has very advanced work and capacities working with Asian manufacturers, Japanese manufacturers in this area. So we clearly see this as a critical feature for this energy systems that rely on more and more with intermittent renewable energy coming to the mix. And we have a number of our jurisdictions. I'm thinking PI, close by to Cape Breton, whose share is now quite high, and they've got ambition to crank it up some more. And there, in which case, you do need energy storage, like in a big way, in order to make such system operate. And that's not unique to Canada. It is one of those, as we have our discussion with the emission innovation countries, one of the priority domains that we all see. And I understand also that the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, led by Bill Gates, has got their sights on storage as a priority investment area. So I would expect a lot of activity in that front over the next decade or so. In terms of EV, this was not a planted question, by the way. The government announced in the last budget some additional monies, and so did provinces. Ontario and a number of came up with either incentive programs or efforts to build up the charging infrastructure across the country, making sure that we address what is arguably one of the top concerns of drivers and consumers, is making sure that they're not stuck without energy along the way. So the manufacturers are working hard to extend that range and make the battery density better and address the safety concerns and reducing costs along the way. But we feel as governments that making sure that the infrastructure be there is a critical contribution we can make. So we've invested $62 million in our last budget. And I would foresee that there will be more of those type of investments in the future. One point I would perhaps emphasize is that we also, as part of this program, invested $46 million for developing demonstration and new technologies in this area. Our ambition is to continue to lower the cost of those charging station units, also develop units for for like condo buildings, multi-apartment units, and making sure that the software apparatus is in there to connect it to the grid. All that kind of back office stuff that may not be deemed to be sexy, but really we need to master if we're looking to do what Frédéric described, which is to bring electric vehicle en masse. When suddenly you plug in 100,000 vehicles, or God knows what in the future, that's starting to have an impact, which could actually be quite positive in terms of dealing with the peak and the system, and using the battery of the cars as a buffer to do that. But trying to model and manage this is a big job for utilities and for ourselves. So we're investing significantly there. And again, an area where we see some of our companies. If I make a plug, at Energy, for instance, it's a Quebec-based company who is the largest operator of charging station, is looking to look beyond the borders at some point to expand. So there's a chance again for us. This is the example I'm using here, but for again Canada to become a platform for clean tech exports and grow that market big time.
Good. Last words, and I'm going to ask you to just talk a little bit briefly to the extent that your province, region, etc., is involved in Mexico. You mentioned on the podium, but maybe you could reiterate, why is Mexico important to Canada's energy future? Let's start with you. We never start with you, Fred.
For us, I think the main relationships we have with Mexico is about the carbon market. As I said, we just signed an agreement with the province of Ontario. We've been working closely over the last years with the Mexican government to support them, and they came to Quebec to see how that carbon market works. So for us, it's important. As I mentioned, we need more jurisdictions put in price on carbon. So we work closely with them, of course. So, but in terms of the electricity and the transmission lines cannot go that further, and on the other side is the same thing. So we are focusing on the carbon market.
Great. Jatan?
So as I mentioned before, our regulator is partnered with the Mexican regulator to develop, as they move forward on their energy sector reform. So we see that as a complement. They looked around the world and decided that Alberta's regulator was the best one out there. So we're happy to share that knowledge. We see it as a real market opportunity for our companies. Certainly if the regulatory environment in Mexico is similar to that in Alberta, that would give Alberta companies a natural advantage, and that they'd be very familiar with operating in that space. Lots of opportunities, certainly in the current price environment. Oil sands projects are very capital intensive and take a number of years to be built, whereas there's some opportunities, I think, in Mexico if the price comes back a little bit. So it's really on that partnership. And then I think, too, as they move forward, they could be an important partner on the infrastructure front in terms of advocating for some certainty around how you get energy infrastructure writ large built in North America.
Frank, Canada, Mexico, important?
Yeah, it's important because it's a priority country for us. And we've made it clear by signing a free trade agreement with them and by really investing significant amount of political capital, but also firms' investments. We heard about those investments in the auto sector or the energy sector. Like we have large investments in the pipeline sector, large Canadian investments that have been made and are expected to occur in Mexico for the future years. So we want to make sure that that partnership extend to the full potential that we see. And energy is all that clearer now that we've spent half a day on that topic, is a common concern for our three countries. So it's not like a forced collaboration. This is an area that Mexico and Mexicans care about for their own sake. So does Canada and Canadians. So there's clearly a commonality of interest in that regard. And in terms of the areas, my colleagues touch on many of those, whether it's around innovation in technology, where Canada has a lot to offer, but also in terms of regs, policy, training, market access, and investment opportunities. Like it's one of those things that we see now. It's not just a dream. Like it's happening, right? B2B, G2G, government to government as well, and a lot of interaction now happening among the scientists directly, which is wonderful.
Great, thank you. Okay, now I'm going to do a little program management on the fly. First of all, we're going to thank these guys, but we're not going to let them leave their seat. So first, let's thank Frank, Jetin, and Frédéric for their excellent presentations. We have a terrific wrap-up speaker, and I can see him. He's sitting 12 feet away from me. And so rather than everybody stand up and resettle, I think what I'm just going to do is invite RJ to come up and wrap us up while we are just sitting here. Is that okay with you guys? You can stand the temperature a little longer. I'd like to invite to the stage to make some wrap-up comments Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson is RJ is a friend to the Wilson Center, to the Canada Institute, the Mexico Institute. We're trying to bring him on as a closer partner and collaborator, and hopefully we can announce something soon about closer collaboration with RJ. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Eurasia Group, a little organization you might have heard of, and he has also been it continues to be, or has been, the head of the Global Energy and Natural Resources Strategy Group. RJ brings a really strong sense of where the world is going in an energy context and what we all need to be doing. To use a Canadianism, he's really good at figuring out where the puck is going. So I would like to welcome Robert Johnson to the stage to make some wrap-up comments. And you don't get to sit down because we don't have enough chairs. You have to stand up. Thanks, RJ.
That's okay, Laura. I've been sitting in an airplane for the last 3 days, so I'm happy to stand, believe me.
A little stretch. Macarena.
Yes. The room got sort of emptier, though, as the day went on here. But
Yeah, we should.
the Canadians at the end, we should have gone first.
No, we should give out the free chips at the end.
Yeah, that's good, though. But we'll go for quality over quantity here. So thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear the panel. I just spent my week in, I didn't get to Mexico City, but I did do Houston, Calgary, and Edmonton. So I've covered most of the continent, it seems. So my concluding comments here, I want to talk about tying a few of these threads together. And really the question is, for North American energy, is it integration, competition, or both? And I think that, obviously this market has a lot to offer. And I think it's now really the dominant oil and gas production block globally. We used to say that maybe, it's the dominant non-national oil company block, but I think now it sort of stands on its own, thanks to the innovations we've seen in shale oil and oil sands and deep water and so forth. And I think if you look at IEA data, there's about 29 projects that have over, at least 10,000 barrels a day of potential that are awaiting final investment decisions in our region. And that excludes entire U.S. shale play and all the prospective Mexican deep water that will come in the bid rounds mentioned this morning. So a lot to look forward to. And I think that my view here is that the prospects are very good, and that the problems in the sector have been largely exaggerated, and I think that the sector in the region are in great position. And it's not to say we haven't had a rough cycle. And I think that our Alberta friends certainly feel like they've been in, the brakes came on a little fast and we got some whiplash. Very tough when you see billions and billions of dollars of spending cut. Mexico, I think they wish the timing had been better for opening up their deep water given the oil price action the last couple of years. And then the U.S. shale sort of proven the rule that, what goes up must come down. But that said, I think there are some good days ahead. Now, we do try to forecast and predict these commodity cycles. It's not always easy to get it right. But what I think we can do here is try to really evaluate which of these assets are going to have the best long-term future. Right? We can't predict exactly the timing of the rebound, but where are they going to go over the longer term? So three angles in this. First is sort of North America versus other regions. Second, the competition within North America. And then third, where this discussion was just going, how is North America positioned for this transition to a lower carbon economy? So in terms of North America versus other regions, I think we have to be careful not to oversimplify and say that, well, things are stable in North America and there are problems everywhere else in the world, so investment is coming here. And if you look at the list of policy problems we've had in North America, it's pretty long. With Keystone, whether you agree or disagree with that decision, it wasn't exactly a great example of efficient public policy making. I'm sure we'd all agree on that. There's a number of other examples we could look at in all three countries. But I do think that we have to be careful not to suggest that our North American market doesn't have political risk. It does have political risk, right? But that's not to say that the emerging markets have been forgotten. Some of the biggest deals we've seen in energy this year beyond North America have been in places like Kashagan in Central Asia and Kazakhstan, the deep water in Guyana off the coast of South America, and even in Papua New Guinea, right? So this competition isn't just within North America, it's really a global competition, even in countries that we don't hear about that often. But having said that, I think while our regulatory process is not where we want it to be and the policy framework is balkanized at times, I'd still rather have our political problems than what we see in other regions. And I think investors feel the same way. I think what we're seeing is what we call onshoring. We talk about that term in manufacturing, and that's basically a lot of the U.S. and Canadian oil and gas companies coming back to their roots, right, to pursue, after decades of looking at international opportunities in conventional oil and gas fields in OPEC countries and Russia and other places, they're coming back to develop the shale gas and shale oil and deep water and oil sands here. So I think they're staying closer to home, and I think the reason for that is that these companies would rather bet on technology in the oil sands or in the U.S. shale or in the Mexican deep water than bet on political outcomes in places like Iraq and Russia, right? And that's a good story, and I think that means that capital will continue to flow into our region. And increasingly, I think for these companies, non-North American means non-core. This is really the core of their energy strategy. One thing we need to look at here as well, that this sort of the rising tide lifts all boats, is the role of the capital markets. And the fact that the North American capital markets are really a strategic resource that no one else has. Right now, the Saudis can fund their own development, but there's a lot of really creative and innovative companies, whether it's in oil and gas or in clean tech, that have access to capital in this region, which is quite strategic. That rests upon the rule of law, and it rests upon a measure of policy predictability as well. Right, and I think when our governments are working well, the energy reform in Mexico, I agree with the positive direction of carbon pricing in Alberta, we're getting the crude export ban lifted here in the U.S., those are the signals the market wants to see. So that's our North America region versus the rest of the world, but what about within North America? And there is pretty fierce competition from what I can see. I think that capital markets will award the most efficient and productive companies in the oil and gas and power sector, but I think it's also the same for countries and regions, right? You start with the geological endowment that each country has in the case of oil and gas, but also becomes a question of which countries and regions are offering policies to attract and sustain capital investment, right? Not just extract rent. And that's something that, especially in a lower oil price environment where there's less spending available, investors are looking at very closely, and boards of big oil and gas and power companies are looking at very closely as well. When oil was $100 a barrel, that covered a lot of sins. There was a lot of willingness to be more patient and take a little more risk on the public policy side as an investor, but that patience is gone now. And the name of the game is risk aversion and looking for policy stability and predictability. And that's quite important. And I think if you look at the example, even in the renewable power sector of year after year trying to get wind and solar tax credits renewed, that was resolved last year, or decisions about, what will carbon pricing be or what will an LNG tax be, those open-ended process or pipeline approvals are what investors probably fear the most. But thankfully, these lessons are behind us, or so we hope. But the capital markets are big and they're robust, and they'll look at the quality of assets and governance throughout all these regions we're talking about today, as well as the abilities of companies to not only profitably but also sustainably and responsibly develop those resources. And that's becoming a lot more important these days. So within the region, I think right now investors love the U.S. shale. A good data point, I think, is in Canada, one of the big Canadian oil and gas companies, Calgary-based, raised $1 billion in the stock market, and they invested in Texas, in the Permian. And there are other examples like that, but I think right now the U.S. shale is sort of outperforming Canada and Mexico. That may not be the case forever, and there's plenty of capital to go around to some extent, but I think what investors like about the U.S. shale is that there's not really any political risk. The crude export ban was the one big risk that was in place that's probably not there anymore, obviously. They also see a short cycle of capital return, low exploration risk, and a lot of ability to leverage and scale up those investments. And I think what investors are doing is basically playing bets across the whole shale complex and hoping that one of them will hit off. So in Canada, I think in oil sands, yes, investors are a little more worried right now. But I think I would agree here with what we've discussed today, that I think the leadership on carbon pricing will lead to wins in market access. And I think that Alberta's stance should move Prime Minister Trudeau and hopefully the next president of the U.S. to help take action to solve the market access issues. And I think we'll see some good news on that front before too long. Of course, I have said that before. I think the oil sands industry is going through a consolidation process, right? But we're going to emerge with stronger companies with stronger balance sheets that will have capital to innovate. And the weaker players that are either less committed to Canada versus other parts of the world or are less committed to responsible development and keeping up with the standards will be out. So I think we're heading to a better place, and I love the idea of the progressive energy producer. I think that's a great concept. I think that will get a lot of traction around the world. Mexican's model is a little bit different. We see pretty much all of our clients at Eurasia Group on the upstream side are interested in the 31 companies that were shown earlier. I think there's a lot of interest in the Deepwater round. As a NAFTA member, Mexico has a huge advantage versus other emerging markets around the world. And I think the Peña Nieto government has done a great job taking that industry feedback on board. And from the first bid round to the next bid rounds, we hear a lot of positive feedback. And I think that will be a successful process for Mexico. I do think the issue there is going to be what happens in the next election and whether there's any kind of walking back of some of the reforms that have been made to date. And sometimes, success is based on the path you don't take. I think the Mexican decision not to go down the Brazilian path of trying to do everything themselves and the resource nationalist model has really helped them a lot because we can see where Brazil is today based on that policy. So I'd say U.S. shale is in a great position, but I see a good path for Canada and Mexico as well. But there is competition. Then lastly, North America in this low carbon transition. Obviously, I would start with the U.S. presidential election as the most important signpost on this. I don't think I need to say a whole lot more about that. You can form your own conclusions. But I think if Hillary Clinton is elected, I would see the Three Amigos process continuing, Canadian hydro across the border, converting fuel in Mexico to natural gas, and developing electric vehicle infrastructure would be strategic opportunities for sure. But a couple of cautionary notes here. I think that the balance, even within Canada, within the U.S., within Mexico, let alone between the three countries, of balancing sort of the national harmonization versus meeting the needs of local jurisdictions is a tough balance. And from an investor perspective, it's sometimes hard to translate what that means. But I think ultimately you need to get these sustainability policies, carbon policies right at the local level, because that's ultimately where these battles are being fought these days. And then lastly, in innovation, I think maybe a little provocative here, but I'm a little worried sometimes that the innovation model in the U.S. is very different than a lot of other places around the world, right? The role of the private equity world and venture capital here, the huge scale of the government labs that they have in the U.S., the universities. I really would encourage Canada and Mexico to look for those sort of niche opportunities that really lend themselves well to their natural advantages, whether it's in, 6 priorities is a lot, but I think there's certainly some of those that will make a lot of sense to focus. And the division of labor concept through mission innovation, I think, is a great idea as well. So in conclusion, I think we're going to see both cooperation and competition here in North America in the energy sector, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive by any means. And I think, probably the next era of North American energy cooperation begins after the presidential election. And if it's anything like the period of Obama, Harper, and Peña Nieto, it won't be dull.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question, and we have probably time for one or two follow-up questions. You gave a great comment about what we're in a pretty good position. The biggest danger now is that we screw things up. You mentioned that good policy helps to build efficiencies. Bad policy is more rent-seeking, rent extraction. Do you have any other observations on what good policy or bad policy looks like?
You know, I think, you know, I'm speaking a little bit from the industry perspective, obviously, but I do think that a lot of this is cyclical, and that in the lower oil price environment, the industry aversion to the rent seeking is even higher, and it's almost impossible to overcome. So I think the LNG tax in British Columbia is a good example of that. I think that you know, that was a concept that took place at a time when LNG prices were very high, and then they dropped, and it wasn't good policy anymore. Yeah. But it probably wasn't good policy in the first place. So I think once it's a really question of that's why I use the term sort of attracting capital and then sustaining capital, right? And I think if we look at another Canadian example with carbon pricing, it's not so much whether carbon price is 30, 50, 100, or even 200, it's just having a price, right? And the same in the U.S., whether it's the implementation of the Clean Power Plan or the rules for local content in Mexico. The more you can get those rules in place and then to keep them constant, I think is one of the most important elements. And it's ultimately, you know, once these decisions are made, assets get repriced, but at least they can go through that process and move forward, knowing what policies will look like.
Transparency, predictability. Quick question from the floor. Gentleman with the microphone is on its way. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, my name is Prab Singh. I'm from Pro Energy. So I'm very curious, when I look at the Canada portfolio of hydro and I compare it to the US renewable portfolio, I see that, you know, US is focusing more on solar right now, and Canada, our neighbor, has so much hydro. And we have so many non-powered dams right now which we can power with hydro at this point. So what do you see, like, how can we encourage the US government to take action such as Canada has taken, develop hydro, which has been successful, and, you know, stick with the basic plan of developing more hydro and avoiding more regulations and trying to get ourselves more renewable with hydro right now?
Thank you. I'm going to kick that at RJ first, but then anybody else on the panel who wants to.
I wouldn't say I'm an expert in hydro. I think the general view in the U.S. is that a lot of those sites have been developed at a large scale, but certainly I hear a lot of interest in the smaller scale hydro projects, as certainly fitting in with renewable portfolio standard and things like that. But I suspect that Frederic may have more insight in that than I do.
Yeah, I think in that sector, the large and the small hydro is all the difference. In Quebec, we have developed the large hydro. In the U.S., it's more a small one. But at the Congress, Senator Murkowski from Alaska presented a bill on energy last session, and they included large hydro. And also they recognize the hydroelectricity as a renewable energy, and that has been a debate in the U.S. for a long time. So they want to recognize it as a renewable. We saw it in the QER of the Department of the Energy, but I think they move forward. But is there a potential to develop large hydro anymore in the U.S., lower 48? I'm not sure. Not sure.
But if you did that, then Frederic could sell less power. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation, your attention, your great questions. Thank you to my speakers and wonderful panelists. It's been a terrific event. Again, Mexico Institute, Canada Institute, we feel that this is one of the most important issues we can work on collaboratively. I can see my partner in crime, Duncan, up in the corner. Anything you want to add, Duncan?
Let's keep the North American conversation going.
Keep the North American conversation. That's great. Okay, thank you. Quick note of thanks. Thanks to Juncan mentioned our wonderful staff, Mexico Institute, Canada Institute. Thank you, team. Thanks to all the folks watching us live on the web. Send us a note. Let us know what you thought. Thank you, of course, to the Wilson Center for wonderful facilities and for the support we get in order to keep on doing this, and to our board members and private sector partners, which are really the engine, gas in our tank, and the power that lets us do what we do. Thank you so much to everyone.